welcome everyone. I'm going to hand it over to John now, and maybe Jim wants to say a couple of words before the meeting starts. And if we have time at the end of the meeting, we will take questions. Please put your questions in the chat or in the comments, and I will see you in a few minutes.
Jim, you want to welcome everybody?
Well, thanks for joining us. We're very pleased that General Clark is able to join us for a conversation with John Florescu. I worked with General Clark when I was ambassador, when he was Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, and when we had that very successful action to stop ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. Now, people don't remember about that because a lot has gone on since then, but it was the first NATO military action. And we've come a long way, and General Clark has done many things since then in terms of being a real leader and advisor to all the subsequent presidents, to all the decision makers, the members of Congress, as well as leaders around the world. And so we're very lucky to have him today to give us his perspectives on what's going on in Ukraine. So General Clark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Yeah, I have good memories of your time as ambassador there.
Thank you.
Well, so anyways, this is John Florescu. I'm in Bucharest, and I welcome General Clark. Good to see you back here. As many of you know, he's a Midwesterner. He was born in Chicago. He was his valedictorian at West Point in 1966. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Magdalen College in PPE, which is Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. It's one of the nicest colleges at Oxford. And then afterwards, he was off to Vietnam, a combatant, and I read in one engagement, he was injured the right shoulder, the right hand, the right hip, and the right leg. And he came out fine. He, of course, was commander of NATO from 1997 to the year 2000. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in the year 2000. He was a presidential candidate in 2004. And I, in fact, saw him campaign in California. And then he endorsed Mrs. Clinton, and then he endorsed President Obama. He has countless military decorations. I'd lose up the whole hour if I had to list them all. Interestingly, his paternal grandparents were from the Russian Empire, Belarus. Is that right?
That's right.
Anyways, I want to say just a thing that crossed my mind. Do you ever regret not being president? It's one of the few honors you haven't got yet. You're not too old either.
Well, it's been some amazing, surprising experiences, John, in my life. And I'll never forget the first time I came to Romania as a NATO commander, and Jim was there as the ambassador. And we had this dinner with Minister Babiuk, I think, who was a Minister of Defense. And I just come from Bulgaria, where they said they wanted to become NATO members. And I said to Minister Babiuk, I said, do you also want to become a member of NATO? He said, yes. I said, well, why is this? Does it have anything to do with Russia? He said, of course. I said, well, are there some incidents that you could explain to me that I could convey to Washington so they understand what this is about? He said, certainly. He said, in 1878, we allowed the Russians to come through our territory and they stole our province of Bessarabia. So I think when I told Washington that there were incidents between Romania and Russia, they thought there were incidents like the Russian ambassador being rude and pushing the Romanian ambassador at some conference or something. They didn't realize the depth of the historic enmities, the effect of war, repeated conflict, death, the family's memories of this generation after generation in Eastern Europe. And that's what we're seeing more of today. There was a guy named David Rody, an author, who wrote a book about Bosnia. And in it, he said, the way that the war was perpetuated in Bosnia was during the Tito era, children could play together from different ethnic groups, but the grandmothers would remember. So they'd say, you can play with little Ivan, but never forget that his grandfather killed your grandfather. And so these memories and this passion, this fear, combination of fear, desire for revenge, pride in the family. When I met General Mladic the first time, he said, to me, most Serbs have lost their fathers in World War II. And it was a piece of rhetoric, but it was also a statement of the pain in a society. And there's a grandfather today, and I look at sort of what happens generation to generation. You look at this and you can only imagine what the tensions and pressures are. You know, John, Ukraine, 17% of their population was killed in World War II. I think it's the highest of any nation, and that follows on top of the Holodomor, the famine. I mean, you can only imagine how people survived through this, what lessons they took from it, the pain. I talked to Ukrainians today, and they always remind me Ukraine was independent before Trotsky led an army there in 1922 and crushed them. So these are really difficult issues, intergenerational, hundreds of years issues being worked out today in Ukraine.
On that score, you know, I think that's exactly the case.
So
And I'll just a little bit of from history or historical resentments. I was reading Putin's speech 2 days before these activities began, and he said, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. What do you think of that, looking at it from his point of view?
Well, look, I think that there's the beauty and the pain of Central and Eastern Europe is the lack of the natural borders. And for thousands of years, the westward migration of these groups from Eurasia packing into Eastern and Central Europe, into Dacia. You know, there were the Huns, and before the Huns, there were the Goths and the Franks and you know, on and on, the Altaic languages that came in and so forth. And then there was the impact of Rome, Greece first, and then Rome and Western civilization moving. I always look at the Balkans as the sort of tectonic plates of human civilization. And that's what I saw in the Western Balkans, at least, because you had Islam, you had Roman Christianity, you had Eastern Christianity there. Of course, Romania, whenever I've been in Romania, I've had great Italian food. And you know, Romanians are always quick to tell me they're not really Eastern European. They're really connected, you know, to the Italians and so forth. Right. And, you know, it's a matter of national pride. And it's also a matter of, you know, of culture. And it's a matter of some amusement, honestly, because when Americans come over, they don't get it. They don't understand it. You know, you ask Americans, well, now, America fought in the Second World War. Do you remember who our adversaries were? You go out on the street, 50% of the people won't know anything about the Second World War. And yet in Eastern Europe, people know about the Second World War. They know about the Balkan Wars of 1910 and 12 with the Turks. Bulgaria and Macedonia, North Macedonia, have had a border conflict. In Romania, people look at Bulgaria and say, south of the Danube. I mean, it's these old attitudes. And especially one of the things I found the most surprising of all was how the Habsburg emperor didn't want to deal with the revolution of 1848 that he saw that swept through the communes in France and into the various states of Germany. And therefore he wanted to keep industrialization out of the Habsburg Empire. Imagine, I mean, he blocked all of that for all those years. And so his idea was, hey, if you need industrial goods, you can buy them. Keep these peasants on the farms. And so in so many places in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania's shifted back and forth with Transylvania and so forth on the Carpathians. I was in Lviv recently. Well, it used to be Lvov, and then it was also has another name. And so when you work in Eastern Europe, you have to respect the memories, the conflicts, the passions, the losses, fears that people have had. So I look, here's what's happening really. Putin has been indoctrinated into the Leninist system of intelligence collection, an enemy everywhere, unlimited use of violence. He's an intelligence asset. That's the way he was brought up, and he saw the United States as the enemy. He then sort of adopted the kinds of philosophical underpinnings from, let's say, Dugin, that supported this worldview. But Putin always knew that he had to retake Ukraine, neutralize the American influence in other states in Eastern Europe in order to protect against the yellow peril. And it's, you look at Xi Jinping and Putin together. Oh, yeah, they signed an alliance document. But that's not a real alliance.
Yeah.
That's a using document. China considers itself an Arctic nation. Now, how is it going to get to the Arctic except by walking over Siberia?
Yeah.
And in fact, 100, just like in Eastern Europe, and Russia stole Bessarabia, fine. Russia also stole a lot of land from China in the late days of the Chinese emperor. And so these passions, these tensions, they go on for generations. What we have to do is move the idea of democracy eastward. The idea that people have freedom of conscience, that you vote, but you respect the people who don't agree with you. You work in a system of rules and laws which are more important than any single outcome. And if we can move that forward, and we are moving it forward step by step, we will produce a different humanity in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and ultimately.
Let me ask you this, General. I remember at the beginning of the war, you were on CNN a lot, and you got the feeling that you felt the United States wasn't, or the Western powers, I should say, was not moving quick enough, that there's a moment of opportunity that had to be seized.
That's right.
Could you tell me a little bit about that, and what's the state of the war in your view right now?
Well, first of all, had we moved expeditiously, we would have gotten a no-fly zone in before the conflict started. Once it started, the no-fly zone, it just became a political football in which people cited a no-fly zone as an excuse not to allow Ukraine to have its support. If you believe in a rules-based international order, then you have to respect Ukraine's ownership legally of the borders and airspace of Ukraine. So if Ukraine invites you in, says, give me some help, you say, sure, I mean, it's your country. We're gonna, if you tell us we're allowed to come in, we're gonna come in. If Russia wants to violate it, that's on Russia. So I had this discussion with a lot of people. It was, I think, just considered too risky at a time of great uncertainty as to what we were going to do. People were waiting to see if Zelensky could hang in there and Kyiv could survive, and they did. And then the war shifted into its second phase, which was this buildup in Donbass and the effort to use traditional Russian military power to pound and pound and pound and use all that artillery dominance. But the thing is, it was basically working. Ukrainians were taking heavy losses and still are. But what Putin didn't understand is his military shattered itself on the highway trying to get into Kyiv. His best units were decimated, and there was really no rationale for the war. It just didn't make sense to the average Russian, even the ones who were in there. So, at first, I guess they thought they were going to have a celebration and people would welcome them. But when the grandmother comes to you and says, "Get off here. We don't want you in this country." And in your own language, after that happens again and again and again, you're going to have people are going to say, "Well, what is this?" And then, the Ukrainians have released some intercepted notes of soldiers calling home, and the mother says, "You fight for the motherland." But the soldier says, "But I'm in here and my commanders are crooked. We're not fed. We don't know what we're doing." And these Ukrainians are fighting for their homes and their lives. So the balance has shifted against the Russian military. And then you brought HIMARS in, which is what really made the difference, because with HIMARS, they were able to target command posts and logistics and disrupt the Russian artillery bombardments to the extent that the front lines held. They haven't collapsed. And we're going into the third phase of the war right now, which is to see whether Ukraine can regain Zaporizhia and Kherson. And it's being fought out on a daily basis in actual battle space and also in the information space. The information space is being fought over the Zaporizhia nuclear facility and the concerns that manufactured concerns that Ukraine might blow it up. Ukraine's not going to blow it up. The Russians occupied it. They're using it as a secure base because they know the Ukrainians can't attack it. And it's a blocking force, it's like an impregnable castle in medieval combat, sitting right there in Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians need to regain Kherson Oblast, ideally before the Russians can run off a fake referendum and then declare that Kherson and the rest of occupied Ukraine is part of Russia. Because
do you think from the Ukrainians' point of view, they have to push further before they get to the negotiating table, before they get into discussion with Russia about some kind of resolution? Is it too early for diplomacy from your point of view if you were judging or advising Ukrainian leadership?
Absolutely. 93% of the Ukrainians believe that Russia should be pushed out of all occupied territories, including Crimea. They want their country back. You see, Putin made a fundamental mistake in the way he set up the war. He set up the war as a genocidal war to destroy a people, their culture, their language, and he's doing it in the filtration camps. I mean, there are tens of thousands of kidnapped children, murdered parents already. We don't know the full dimensions of this because, as clumsy as the Russian military has been, their filtration operations seem to be pretty specific, pretty exact. It's ethnic cleansing on a scale unknown in Europe since the Holocaust. And it's going on right in front of us, and people are talking about a peace agreement. I didn't hear anybody, I wasn't alive in 1944 until 1944, so I don't see anything in the history books about people saying in 1943, 1944, we really need to sign a peace agreement with Hitler. We really need to stop all those people getting killed on the Eastern Front. And, we like French wine, and it's a shame the Germans are in there, but maybe we can share something. No, nobody said that. Yeah. And yet the voices demanding a halt to the fighting have no appreciation for what this war means to the people of Ukraine.
So when you say the voices,
they're fighting, John, they're fighting for their very existence.
Right.
There won't be a Ukraine if they lose. And what they know is that if this is stopped right now with Russia occupying the southern coast, that Putin will have a military breathing spell in which he can rebuild his forces, rearm, get the technology he needs from China or India or smuggling it in. And by next spring, boom, the rest of Ukraine will be under attack. And without the South Coast, without that farmland, the industrial land of the Donbass, Ukraine's a much less viable proposition. Putin wants to destroy it. If he had come in and said, "You people in Ukraine, you have a really bad government. We want to help you with your government. so forth. Let us, with the great example of Russia, maybe we
Yeah.
can help you have a better government. Maybe he could have done something. He thought he had bought off the Ukrainian people. There's this, there was a series in the Washington Post recently, but it's also, I've heard it from foreign sources. Apparently, Putin gave his intelligence agencies several $billion over 6 years to buy Ukraine. And apparently this fifth directorate of the FSB decided, well, everybody else makes money in Russia. We were at 2 billion. I'll take a little bit from it. And everybody took a lot from it and nothing happened. And until the end. And so maybe they bought off some people in the Kherson Oblast. That's the suspicion. A couple of people defected and so forth. That's a Russian way of war. But they didn't buy off Ukraine. And I think they were shocked. And so now the Ukrainians, how could you accept a imposed peace by Western powers that say, just give up your country? I mean, you wouldn't do it. You're giving up your language, your culture, your history. And this is a Ukrainian culture goes back hundreds of years. John, I'll just tell you one little incident. When I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, one of the retired generals, I said, it's such a shame. You look at all these young men dying and all the destruction. And I expected him to say, yeah, it's a terrible thing. You know what he said? He said, this war was inevitable. He said, they stole our civilization.
Yeah.
This monk, I think his name was Theodore, in something like 1647, went to Peter the Great and said, you should call it Rusland instead of Muscovy.
Mm-hmm.
And they stole our civilization. So, these passions are deeply rooted among people. I'm sure there's a lot of young people in Ukraine who say, hey, I'm getting out of this. This is a terrible thing. And, I just want to go to the West. I'm an IT expert and I'll be fine somewhere else. Maybe there are, but there are millions who treasure their identity, their national identity, and their families and their heritage. And they realize that when the Russians come in, they have a list. So they know who they're going to target. And that list is an enormous list of people who have supported the Ukrainian government.
Do you share that? You're speaking there with tremendous insight, because as a historian and also as a tactician, and I'll ask you to put on a political hat. It seems to me that there's still a reticence or within the West to develop a kind of firm consensus. I mean, we had England, maybe under Boris Johnson was a little more aggressive than who knows what comes next. I think you see Macron sort of saying it's time to put the pressure on Zelensky rather than on and even Henry Kissinger, who was finding a kind of intellectual framework to justify that we have to keep Russia in the European community. There seems to be different tugs in different directions that threaten to undermine what you're talking about. Essentially, is to step up the game to conclude this thing. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think that it's a very normal reaction, and we shouldn't condemn it, that states do the minimum and try to maintain stability and the existing order. That's just normal, especially for democracies. Democracies don't have long-term strategies that are based on the conquest of territories. This is for autocracies like what Putin's running or what Xi Jinping is running in China. So we're always going to do the sort of minimum. It's what Winston Churchill said. Democracies will always do the right thing when every other course of action is exhausted, to paraphrase it. And what's happened is that in the West, there was concern that maybe, Zelensky seemed to be an amateur. We knew there were issues, corruption issues, Russian influence in the government and in the military and the intelligence circles. People had some real reservations about whether Ukraine would stand up. But as Ukraine has stood up, the issues have become more and more clear. So I think it's a case where Mr. Putin is going to have to recognize he's made a fundamental mistake and back out of this. That's the only way this is going to end, unless for some reason Western powers decided, okay, we don't care about 40 million people. We don't care about ethnic cleansing. We don't care about international law. We don't care about our values, and we don't care about NATO. Because all of the Eastern European NATO countries understand that if Putin rolled through Ukraine, they're next.
Someone was making the point that they're just giving enough military support to kind of balance the play, not too much to upset anybody, and too little to really, do something significant, which always touches on the question of the fear of nuclear weapons, which has always been the unspoken threat here. From your understanding, has there been any danger or have we been on the brink of any limited tactical nuclear weapons, or is this just a bluff in the pocket?
I don't think we're on the brink of any use of tactical nuclear weapons. I think the threat was useful for Mr. Putin, but I don't think that the use of tactical nuclear weapons at this point makes sense. The diplomatic impact, the economic impact, the global outrage of the use of nuclear weapons would outweigh any tactical advantage at this stage. That having been said, Mr. Putin can use nuclear weapons whenever he wants. If he were winning, he could have used them to say, look, I'm just going to finish this conflict really quickly, just like you Americans did in Japan in 1945. If he's losing, he can say, well, we're going to destroy everything that's left, and you're not coming after us in Russia. He could use them whenever he wants. But I think in terms of the calculus, and he's still a pretty shrewd statesman. He's the most experienced global leader on the stage today. He still has excellent connections with governments all over the world. And he has personal relationships with many of these people. President Macron calls him frequently. He knows what the temperature, he knows, you got to find a better way out than trying to blast your way out with nuclear weapons. So I think we're a long way from that. I do think there's some urgency, though, on the military side for the Ukrainians. They need to get this fighting done in Kherson and retake Crimea this year. And that's a matter of the West stepping up. And we've had real concerns. I mean, Germany, has such a mixed historical legacy with respect to Ukraine and Eastern Europe. But the majority of the German people are not supporting Chancellor Scholz and his reluctance to send weapons. They see the threat. They want the threat pushed back. I don't think any of this goes into something like regime change against Putin. Nobody's talking in those terms. But you have to ask yourself, when this ends, this is a leader who started an aggressive war in the heart of Europe that's resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, 10 million displaced people and refugees, trillions of dollars of damage, disrupted and causing starvation elsewhere in the world. And he's guilty of the most heinous crimes of ethnic cleansing, taking children away from their parents, murdering people in these filtration camps. What are you going to do? Welcome him back at the United Nations and applaud when he gets up to speak? So I think, we just haven't come to terms with that in the political system, John. And the longer this goes on, the more likely it is that the political system will come to terms with it, and the deeper Putin's losses. He needs to cut and run right away if he wants a chance of reintegration into the global community, in my view. And that's
You
the
were
advice
saying-
I would give him.
You
He's
were
in
saying
deep trouble.
you were saying there that Putin probably doesn't realize he has a losing hand. Not yet, anyways. What's his biggest military issue? Is it the lack of fresh troops? Is it the computer chips that are coming from washing machines to support some of their equipment? Is it supply lines? What is his big military issue?
Well, I think he's got several big military issues. First of all, his best units have been shattered, and he's having real difficulty rebuilding his military structure. But even before that, he premised the invasion on bad intelligence. He thought Ukraine would collapse. It didn't collapse. The Ukrainians told me before this, he can't possibly intend to invade Ukraine with 200,000 troops. We're a huge country. We're 600 miles east, 1,000 kilometers east to west. You can't occupy and do anything with that country with 200,000 troops. They knew it. That's why one of the reasons why Zelensky was slow to accept the intelligence. But what he didn't understand is Putin thought he's going to roll right in, bunch of traitors show up, Russian sympathizers in every little town, inside every police force, inside the mayor's offices and in the oblast provincial governments. And that people would just say, oh, well, thank God Russia's back, these Ukrainians. But it didn't happen. And so he disengaged there. The Russian military then it's a powerful military, but he's lost a lot of leadership. The leadership was targeted. That's been intensified with the arrival of HIMARS, which is taking out the command post. The logistics wasn't structured really for a war of movement. Russian logistics depends on railroads. So they don't run on highways. The American logistics runs on trucks, not railroads. So when he gets very far from the railhead, he can't resupply his troops. Yes, they're running out of new equipment and new hardware. He overestimated the impact of the so-called Russian modernization. Before World War II, Stalin started building the Soviet military machine in 1927. In 1939-40, he had more than 300 divisions worth of equipment. And when British and Western leaders told him in 1941, you better be careful because Hitler's going to attack you. This was after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and he'd occupied half of Poland. Stalin could laugh it off. He said, Hitler can't be that stupid. I mean, he has like 6 panzer divisions, and they're running on horse-drawn logistics. Most of his people are walking across Russia. This is like a Napoleonic invasion. He said, my people move in trucks and so forth. I mean, he just couldn't believe that Hitler would attack. He had a real military machine, and they'd fought through the Russian Civil War for several years. Putin's an amateur. He never fought a war. That Russian military machine collapsed. It was sold off for parts, for corruption purposes, for exports for 30 years. And suddenly, he tries to spring it into action. Now, you give him, with his government, a couple of years, China's support, control of the information space in Russia, unlimited repression of dissent. He might be able to manufacture a military machine. That's what the Ukrainians are concerned about. That's why we have to finish this now, convince Putin he can't win, and get him out of there, and then let him figure out his own way to survive. And maybe he'll be angry for a couple of years, but maybe you can go in with other blandishments, and maybe Putin will recognize it's a different world. Maybe he won't. But this is the moment of opportunity for the Ukrainian military.
You mentioned there about crimes against humanity, and you know something about that from your experience in Kosovo, where many of these people ended up going to jail. And there seems to be every day new revelations about various atrocities that have been committed all around the Ukraine. And you always get the feeling that when is this going to play out? Is it ever going to happen? Do you have a feeling that this process of going after some of these heinous crimes will actually be successfully prosecuted?
Well, it takes years to do this. And one of the big differences is people look at Russia and Putin and they say, oh my God, Milosevic, he was just a Balkan dictator. They were just Serbs. Here you're going against Mother Russia with 10,000 nuclear weapons and Putin, and you can't imagine this could happen. And so it's going to take a couple of years to penetrate into the political system before people realize that, according to some of my friends in the intelligence community and military community, World War III already has begun. Mm-hmm. They'll tell you that, Putin decided several years ago with China that they couldn't stand the US-based international system of values and structures, and they're going after it. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly for those of us in the West, public opinion doesn't support that. Informed opinion in Western Europe, at least, still says, well, after the war, we still want to buy Russian gas and oil, when can we speak with Mr. Putin again and about our trade deals and investment? Our businesses want back into that Russian market, and so there's this still this longing to get back in. But what we don't remember is that American investment built up the German armaments industry in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And there was strong American investment interest in staying in those, like Krupp, for example, the big German armaments maker. And after World War II, one of the things that the Marshall Plan did was encourage Americans to reinvest in industry in Germany, in Western Germany. And so these economic forces that emanate from democratic societies are always present, but they will be overcome eventually by the political forces, by the democratic forces of revulsion of these horrible atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine in the name of Putin's imperialistic dream of destroying Ukraine. People will respond.
Right. When I think back to, sorry,
John, he needs to call it off.
And what will make him do that?
It's going to be only reversals on the battlefield, plus the behind the scenes leverage exerted by China and India. They could exert that. Right now, they haven't quite done it. This is one of my concerns with the West is got all these fence sitters out there in East Africa and South Asia. They're fence sitting because they're not sure that we really mean it in the West when we say rules-based international order, democracy, human rights, respect your neighbors, don't solve problems by force, go to the international legal system. They're not sure we mean it. If you can't defend it by force, the United Nations, has always had the problem, like the League of Nations before it, that it doesn't have the power to defend this system. But we will lose the United Nations, just like we lost the League of Nations, if we don't defend this system. So right now, in the Middle East, in South Asia, people are still on the fence. They're saying, well, does President Biden really mean it? It's looking like he does. Yeah, he just got another weapon shipment of almost $1 billion going into Ukraine. Looks like he might mean it. But mighty Russia, you mean they can't conquer Ukraine? Maybe Russia's not as strong as we thought.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't have to be as afraid of Russia. Maybe we can speak up for our own values. And so this tide has to shift. It takes courageous leadership in Western capitals, including in the United States, to do this. The United States is the leader. You cannot lead NATO from behind. When I was a NATO commander, I'll never forget, I was in a North Atlantic Council meeting, and the Greek ambassador came up to me and he said, General Clark, he said, these factories of truck factories you're bombing in Serbia, they're owned by Greeks. I said, yeah, but they're producing trucks for Serbs. He said, I know. He said, I'll tell Athens this. And
well, it's interesting.
So, I mean, they're looking for American leadership and strong leadership, and we're doing it step by step by step. And some in Europe have said we should have been stronger. Yeah, you can make that charge. I would have liked to have seen the MiG deal go through and give Ukrainian more. I would like to have seen more
airplanes.
But they are now getting much more equipment coming in. We're tipping on the balance point. The question is, can we get enough in the next 4 or 5 weeks that Ukraine can establish the military conditions in which Russia and Putin decide this is ridiculous. Pull this thing back, call it off. Let's do something different. Let's say we're having a winter festival in Russia and we need our troops back or something. Make something up. Get out of there. And
you think that
of course, Putin could do anything he wants.
Do you think that the Western nations will say, or Zelensky himself will say, that going back to the borders of February of this year is a sufficient win, although it's not a win? Or do you think
all this? No way. No way. Now, maybe Germany and France would say that. They're not there, I mean, sometimes I hear Europeans say, it's like, well, as long as there are 1 or 2 nations between us and Russia, we're safe because somebody will do something before they can get to us. But maybe that's not the case. I think more and more Europe is seeing the fact that security, safety, stability is indivisible in Europe. This has been the dream really since the fall of the Berlin Wall. France gave it to us. They said a Europe whole and free, Atlantic to the Urals. And we actually hoped that Russia would be part of this. We didn't go beyond the Urals because we didn't want to interfere with, Asia and China. It was like a Europe. Urals is where traditionally Europe stops. So that was the dream. And that's why NATO took action in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, because they realized security in Europe is indivisible. Now, right now, NATO has said, okay, we're not getting involved. Okay, that's okay. It was a ploy. It was a way of sort of denying Putin the ability to say he was going to go against war against NATO. Okay, I got that. But all of these NATO nations are involved, and the nations in Eastern Europe, Romania, one of them, but especially in the Baltics, they're petrified that what would happen if Putin succeeded in Ukraine. They know what would happen. You look at Finland and Sweden, they joined NATO for a reason.
Yeah.
I was NATO commander. I'd go to these countries and they'd say, we'd really like to be in NATO. We work really close with you, but our people, they don't see any reason for it. Okay. Yeah. They see a reason for it now. It's popular in these countries. That's why they did it, because they see that security in Europe is fundamentally indivisible in this age. So Putin needs to pull back. He needs to recognize he hit the immovable force. It's the same thing that happened to Milosevic in a way. When we were first going into the fight in Serbia, Milosevic was saying things like, well, Serbia owns Kosovo. Kosovo is part of Serbia. These people in NATO, they don't even know where Kosovo is on a map. They don't care about it. He was right. But what he didn't understand was when NATO got engaged, NATO couldn't lose, or you'd lose NATO. So therefore, Milosevic hit the immovable force in NATO. Now, NATO's not directly engaged in this, but Putin has hit the immovable force. He's got all the wealth and population of Eastern, Central, and Western Europe recognizing increasingly that he's not going to get away with it. He needs to recognize reality and pull back. All the lip worship of nations in East Africa, India buying his oil, fence sitting in the Gulf, and so forth, that's not going to save Putin. He needs to pull back.
You were making some interesting analogies with this situation in Kosovo in the late 1990s. And there's a difference also between America's relationship, the United States, with NATO then versus today. Because if I recall events well, people were sort of waiting around to see what the Europeans would do to clean up the situation in former Yugoslavia. And nothing really moved forward. And then finally, the United States, you in charge, got to the job. It took whatever it took to do. And that isn't the same relationship today between the United States and NATO. You wear two hats. You're former head of NATO and you're a prominent American personality. What do you feel about that evolution? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think the United States back in 2009 or 10, under the Obama administration, sought to develop a new direction in U.S. foreign policy. And there was a meeting with Russian President Medvedev in which he was told essentially, look, we want to work with you people, and we're not too worried about Europe. And this was after Russia had invaded Georgia. So it was a fundamental misunderstanding of Putin. But nevertheless, the meeting was, we're interested in Asia. And by the way, we're going to do stuff in space. Don't mess with us in Asia. Go ahead and develop your economic relations with Nord Stream and Germany and so forth. And let's look for stability. President Biden, in 2021, 12 years later, provided the same prescription for Putin. He said, we hope you'll be a stable, statesman and part of the international system and so forth. You know what to do. When he met with him, I think it was in Geneva in July of last year. And he could have lowered the hammer on him, told him what would really happen, but he didn't. He's still, and the United States national security strategy at that point was still saying, stabilize Europe and face Asia. My problem with this strategy and my concerns, as I've expressed to a number of people, are that actually, number one, Putin is an agent of instability and disruption. Russia has been since Vladimir Lenin and the creation of the Communist International, where they have attempted consistently over many years to destroy governments in the West. And so it's very difficult to see him as a factor of stability. Multiple administrations have tried to cut a deal with Russia. Condoleezza Rice told me before in 2000, we're going to work with Russia. Oh, sure, work with Russia. And all they did was, abrogate the ABM treaty. No administration's been able to work with Putin because he wants the Soviet Union back. On the other hand, China, it's like the dog chasing the car. We finally catch the car. What's the dog going to do with the car? What are you going to do with China? You don't want the Chinese government to collapse. You're intertwined economically with China in a way that you aren't with Russia. China has pretensions of historic inevitability, its role as a leading power in mankind's history, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, there's ego there. There's a separate civilization. Somehow the world's got to be big enough for both the Enlightenment of the 18th century with John Locke and Rousseau and all that's transpired over 300 years, and the Confucian civilization of China. Somehow the world's got to be big enough for that. And we've got to find a way to make that happen. The only one who wants to see a war between the United States and China is Russia. And that's the Stalinist strategy that he's repeated from World War II. So we've got to understand what our priorities are. You've got to push Putin back. You've got to find a modus vivendi with China.
I mean, listening to you here, you're telling us a lot about Russian leadership or maligned, evil Russian leadership or Kremlin leadership. And also you're really talking about American leadership too. And you're a historian to some extent. You studied history at Oxford and probably throughout your life. Do you think there's been a turning point in American leadership in terms of, where we've entered a new phase as America accepted a new role? Does that concern you?
No, I don't think, American leadership still operates on America's fundamental national interests, except for Donald Trump. And I don't like to talk about politics beyond the water's edge, but he did shake a lot of people's confidence. But excluding those 4 years, American foreign policy is very consistent.
Yeah.
It's very much focused on America's interests.
Yes.
Now, it's been always a balance between our call for human rights and democracy and self-determination of nations and the interests of America's economy, bringing in foreign investment, having the opportunity to sell products abroad, investing abroad, establishing a trade system that lets the financial system work, et cetera. But pretty consistent.
General, I see that Raluca's popped on the screen, so that must be people who wish to talk, ask questions.
Yes, and to let everybody know that they can place their questions in the comments, and I'm sure that everybody, including myself, has been just listening, really fascinated to the General's comments and insights. We do have one question, the first one from YouTube, and then I know that Ambassador Rosapep also has a question for you. The YouTube question is, Romanians remember Chernobyl. Why shouldn't they be worried about the threat of nuclear fallout from either an attack or a power plant failure? Excuse me.
Well,
knowing that
they should be worried about it. But the interesting thing about this conflict has been how much Putin has held back. It hasn't been by the Russians a war of total devastation. The only thing he wants to do is get rid of the Ukrainian people. He wants bridges, the power plants, the mines, and so forth. And he'll take any Ukrainians who are willing to become Russians. But if you want to stay Ukrainian, he wants to get rid of you. So there's a lot of deterrence that's gone on and a lot of restraint that's gone on. So barring some fundamental mistake, I don't see Zaporizhia becoming a new Chernobyl. The Ukrainians are not going to bomb it. Putin doesn't want to destroy it at this stage because he still thinks he's going to take over Ukraine. He wants it. So I think for now we're okay.
Jim, I think you said you have a question there. We don't see you, but there you are.
No, I do have a question. This has been a very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask a counterfactual. If we had not provided the military aid that we have been providing, if we did not do the sanctions, if what would have happened over the past 6 months in Ukraine, do you think?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainian army was determined to fight no matter what. Secondly, most of the tanks that were destroyed and the equipment that was destroyed in the assault on Kyiv, they were not destroyed by javelins. Aircraft were not taken down by Stingers. That stuff got in late. It was poorly distributed. And in the military, if you want to have a weapon system effective at a certain point, you got to distribute it everywhere because you don't know where it needs to be. So I don't want to say that this wasn't important. It was, but when I talk to the Ukrainians, what they tell me is that they were going to fight no matter what. Maybe they wouldn't have been as successful. Certainly in the struggle around Donbass, we provided maybe 300 tubes of artillery, and they started with maybe 700 tubes of artillery. So, and they've lost a bunch of artillery. So what we provided is really important. But they've managed to preserve their Air Force. They've been very adroit with their SA-300 air defense. And yeah, we've sent them some blowpipes and we've sent them some various things. And we keep talking about sending them this NATO medium range air defense system, but it's not there yet. And so we didn't give them Patriots. We have intelligence that we're not sharing with them. We said we wouldn't do targeting. Maybe other nations are helping that. We're not doing that. So, you know, they've got to take a lot of pride in their fight. Maybe it wouldn't be this well, but I guarantee you they were going to fight. Once this war started, they knew what it was about.
Thank you.
General, you were giving some statistics earlier on, and it seems to me the media paints often conflicting images of the war all the time, and some basic statistics are always much disputed. I've heard that the Russians have lost maybe 40,000, 50,000. That's almost as much as U.S. lost in Vietnam. The Ukrainians, we never get any. In terms of statistics there on the war, do you have anything a little more insider?
Well, you know, I don't really have anything more than that. My guess is in military parlance, when you start to lose 30% of the personnel or capabilities of a unit, it becomes essentially combat ineffective. So the Russians have right now, let's say they went in with 200,000 people and maybe not even 200,000 because maybe some of the units weren't fully manned. They went in light on logistics. They started taking these losses. They couldn't resupply. They couldn't even provide first aid for their people. They couldn't evacuate them, get them to hospitals. So if you said they lost 40, 50,000 people, I believe that. That's a very credible figure to me.
Yeah, and
what
close
would
to
the
30%.
Ukrainians have lost? Maybe less because they were mostly on defense. Maybe the Ukrainians have lost half that amount, but they also have a mobilizable reserve that is being in the process of being equipped and enabled to fight outside its particular oblast. And so actually the manpower advantage is starting to run to Ukraine right now. Russia's hurting.
Well, Luca, I think you had another question queued up there.
Actually, we are about 3 minutes from the top of the hour, so I wanted to give you the opportunity to close out. Last thoughts.
How optimistic are you, or where's your head at right now? Because I've watched you since the beginning of this conflict. I describe you as impatient and unsatisfied with the state of Western engagement or American engagement in this, and I have a bit that same feeling now.
Well, I think, you know, a lot of us have pushed and prodded and pulled to try to increase the amount of assistance given by the West and by the United States. And I think gradually the United States has done more and more. I especially commend the relationship between the two militaries and particularly the relationship with General Milley that he has with General Zaluzhny. I think that's a very solid relationship. Secretary Austin with Minister of Defense Reznikov, very solid. So I think it's coming along the right way. I'm cautiously optimistic at this stage, provided we continue to flow the material in at maybe an accelerated rate over the next 4 to 6 weeks to enable Ukraine to seize Kherson Oblast. I'm fearful of what will happen in the winter with continuation of sanctions. And so that's the problem, is, you know, we've got a short window of opportunity here militarily. After that, politics and economics will weigh in more heavily.
Yeah, well, I think that's a heart-lifting commentary to the Ukrainian people themselves, what you just said there, and with the necessary cautionary note about whether the Russian people have more of a tolerance for sacrifice than the Westerners, and that as a cold winter comes across maybe Western Europe, and where we're hearing about rationing, that people will start saying, well, like you said earlier, does it really matter that much? So I've asked people to make predictions of how quickly all this has to happen. I know that Henry Kissinger said in Davos that we had to come to some solution with 2 months. Otherwise, Russia would make other arrangements with other world alliances, which seems to be the case. But I'll take your cautiously optimistic summary. And I have to thank you for a fascinating, normally I try to get more questions in, but I thought it would get in the way of such a fascinating projection of the situation from someone who's a patriot and an insider as well. So thank you very much, General. I'm enormously grateful, and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, Jim. Great to see you again. Thank you. I'm sorry I talked so long.